Megan and I went to IKEA the other day, and I like IKEA, which is funny because normally it wouldn't be the type of place that I like to go to, but it's kind of a happy place, and there's lots of bright colors and lots of fun-shaped things, so I kind of enjoy it. But I got to tell you, I was also enjoying every once in a while you'd find somebody who was swimming upstream, and it would sort of make me feel all exhilarated. I was like, you go against the arrow. I'm not a rule follower, so that was kind of fun. But we went there basically just to buy jam and then to have lunch, because what's wrong with meatballs for $5 for lunch, right? So we went and did that. And then on our way out, you know how you pass through the warehouse where you get the stuff that you'll put together later and then regret it? We were in that section, and I was noticing that there was a little family right in front of us. You know, what I presumed was a dad and a mom and a little girl. And I don't know, she looked to me to be, 3, 4, something like that. Relatively little, but still big enough. And she's just kind of doing little girl things. You know, she's kind of running around and jumping up and down and skipping around and being happy. And I had little girls, so that always makes me smile. And all of a sudden, her dad, I presume it was her dad, turned and said something to her, just absolutely snarled at her. And this little girl completely recoiled, and I was really afraid that the next thing that he was going to do was haul off and hit her. I mean, it was that type of thing that went on, like from me to the front row there. And I'm like, oh, if he hauls off and hits her, I'm going to have to say something or do something. And it made me think about how much power we have. Most of us, if I were to say to you, you've got a lot of power, most of us would say, I don't have any power at all, because we're comparing ourselves to other people. But we all have a tremendous amount of power. Whether it's the power that dad had over his little girl, or the power that we have over a spouse. If you've got employees, you have power over your employees. You even have power over the people that are around you. I mean, even sitting here this morning, if you are not into this morning, you can kill the mood in your entire section. You have a tremendous, I see it happen. You have a tremendous amount of power. You have power over the people who serve you. In Chicago in January, when the pastors were back there for our midwinter conference, we went to a restaurant of a friend of Matt Knapp's, and we were talking to him afterwards, just had this great time. And he confirmed what I always thought, which is that restaurateurs, particularly those who are just starting a restaurant, live in absolute fear of a bad Yelp review. Because people read those things, and it can literally kill a restaurant. We have all sorts of power. And so the question that I want you to think about is, how do you use yours? You have power. How do you wield it? And we're going to look at a couple examples this morning of people who have power, who use their power very, very differently. And so the first person we're going to look at is a guy named Caiaphas. We're in the middle of a sermon series called The Cast of Characters. And it's about the people who were around and played a part in the last couple of weeks leading up to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And so today we're going to tackle this guy. And I'm going to break one of the chief homiletics rules that they give you in seminary. And that is, never preach from two different texts. But because you all are extraordinary, I'm going to believe that you can hang with me. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 26. And Matthew writes, those who had arrested Jesus, so we're in the last part of Holy Week, right before the crucifixion, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. So let's stop there and let's define a couple of terms so that we're all on the same page what we're talking about. So we're talking about this group of people called the Sanhedrin. What is the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin, first of all, is a Greek word. It just means gathering. But what it really was the supreme religious court of Judaism. So it's 71 people, why, I don't know, who were primarily made up of priests and former chief priests and scribes, lawyers, leading citizens. And they had control over all of the religious affairs of the Jewish state. So this is the group that's gathered together. So it's a pretty big, hairy deal when we talk about the Sanhedrin. The second thing that's mentioned that might need some definition is the idea of a high priest. Well, we don't have priests. Well, we do have priests, but what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about the high priest? So in Judaism, you have a temple system, and the priests are there doing what priests do. Priests are mediators between people and God. And so they're doing sacrifices on behalf of the people and all kinds of other things. But the high priest is a unique office. And it's important to what we're talking about today because this guy Caiaphas is the high priest. The thing that really makes his job distinct from everybody else is once a year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest goes in to what's called the Holy of Holies. It's the holiest place in all of Judaism. It is the absolute core center of the temple, and nobody goes into it. Only the high priest, and he only goes in once a year. Because this place is where the people perceive that God dwells. To enter into the Holy of Holies is to be in the presence of God. And so this is a pretty special thing that only one person gets to do only once a year. And the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, which comes down to us as Yom Kippur, generally celebrated in September. And he does two things. He burns incense before God and fills the whole place with this incense. Incense is almost always related to the prayers of the people. So he's bringing the prayers of the people before God. But in the Second Temple period, it also connotes atonement for sin. So the high priest comes in, and with him, he brings all of the prayers that have been prayed by all of the people in the previous year. And he brings them with the idea that God is at work. Atonement is to make things better, to make things change, to be reconciled with one another. The next thing that he does after that is he takes blood from one of the sacrifices, he's got it in a bowl, and he sprinkles it. Now at this time, the Ark of the Covenant is long gone. It is not in the temple. What they have is the place where the Ark of the Covenant was. And so he sprinkles it in the place. And that is a reminder that when blood is shed, it's the only way that sin is atoned for. So the whole thing is about the high priest going in and making atonement for the sins of the people so that God will forgive them and reestablish them and have their relationship made new. So, I don't think it's a stretch to say that this one guy who once a year atones for the sin of the people should have some connection with God and should understand God and should understand what God is doing in the world, because after all, he's a huge cog in the wheel of atonement and making things right. And this guy's name is Caiaphas. And for those of you who care, this won't be on the test, but I found it interesting. Back in 1990, they were expanding a road in the southern part of Jerusalem, and as often happens there, when the bulldozers went through, it opened up an old tomb. And so whenever that happens, it stops and the Department of Archaeology goes in. And it was a tomb of a very important family. And inside they found a number of ossuaries, which are just bone boxes. Because the way that they buried people at the time, and you see this with Jesus, is they take a body and they just lay it out on a slab. and then they seal up the tomb, and they come back in a year, and by then the body has just decayed. And if you're rich, they take your bones and they put them in a bone box. If you're poor, they just move the bones to the side and leave space for the next people. So there's these bone boxes, ossuaries, and they're very, very elaborate, which means the people that are buried there are very, very rich and very, very important. And on the side of one of them, it says, Joseph, son of Caiaphas, which is this person that we're talking about. So there's every reason to believe that they discovered the bones of Caiaphas. But like I said, it won't be on the test. That was just for free. So those are the players in what's going on. The next note is that they're looking for something. And it says that they're looking for false evidence. Well, why do you look for false evidence? You look for false evidence when there's no real evidence. So they're trying to railroad somebody. They're trying to find something that isn't there so that they can charge somebody with something. And so the real question then is, why are they looking for evidence at all against Jesus? And for that, we have to go to John. So at least it's another gospel. Sorry about that. And so look at John chapter 11. 3 books to the right, if you've got a paper Bible. And John writes, and it's about the same thing. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man, Jesus, performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. So, the beginning of the backstory is that there's a crisis. There is the status quo. And in the status quo, everybody knows where they fit. Everybody has a station in life. And as long as that doesn't change, it's all good. And now, Jesus comes in and he's beginning to upset the status quo. And that's making people nervous. Because it could end up in a riot. It could end up in armed conflict with Rome. And it's just going to create chaos. They're afraid that he's whipping the people up into a frenzy. And as the leaders, they don't want trouble. And it's interesting to me, Megan and I watched The Help last night again, which is a fictionalized account. It's not exactly how things happen, but I think it's not far from true of what happened in some places in the South. And it's a story about primarily domestic help who are almost all African American, working for primarily white people, and how they're treated. And it sort of walks through the injustice of it all. And there are several lines in there that just kept striking me again, enough that I added it to the sermon this morning, is people kept saying, why do we need to change? Everything is fine the way it is. And I thought, when you're the person at the top of the heap, everything is fine the way it is. But if you're not the person at the top of the heap, things are not fine. And I wonder how often we tolerate things because it's going okay for us. And that's exactly what Caiaphas is doing. I wonder how many times we put up with injustice because it doesn't bother us. I remember somebody talking about in the Second World War how much the Italian people put up with because Mussolini made the trains run on time. And as long as things were convenient and people themselves weren't impacted, it was pretty easy to just maintain the status quo. We don't want things to get out of hand. And so the leaders are all together trying to figure out what to do. Verse 49. Then one of them named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. So Caiaphas makes this prophecy, and it is in fact a prophecy. But Caiaphas making this prophecy falls squarely into the category of everybody gets it right every now and then, or God can work through anybody. Because the prophecy is so much bigger than what Caiaphas is thinking about. All Caiaphas is thinking about is, if the whole nation's going to be in trouble, better than one person die. And it ends up being a prophecy because one person is going to die, but it's not just going to be for the benefit of the nation, it's going to be for the benefit of the world. Caiaphas is correct, but it's for a much bigger reason that he thinks. But Caiaphas is incorrect because it's not at all what he wants. Notice that in verse 48, their concern is that if Jesus keeps doing all of these miracles, that people will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Note that he does not say the Romans will come and destroy the temple and our nation. He only notes that the Romans will take their power away, and that's what he's worried about. The language, our temple, our nation, this is our deal. The 70 of us sitting in this room. He's not caring a lick really about the rest of the country. I'm not even sure that he cares about the temple itself. I think what he cares about is his own position of power. So Caiaphas is one of those people that has power. And when he has the opportunity to wield it, he uses it for his own good. What can I do that will be best for me? And I know that this is true because in verse 49, it actually mentions this twice. It notes that Caiaphas was high priest that year, which would lead you to believe that the office of the high priest had a 1-year term. Only that's not true. The office of high priest was pretty much a lifetime appointment until you irritated the Roman governor. And then he deposed the high priest and picked somebody else. The guy before Pilate, who was the Roman governor at the time, the guy named Gratus, replaced the high priest so frequently that it came to be known as a 1-year term. Caiaphas, on the other hand, was in office for about 15 years because he never did anything that irritated Pontius Pilate. The reason that Caiaphas eventually lost his office was only because Pilate lost his. And so you've got this odd situation where you should have people who are on completely opposite sides. You have the Roman governor, the symbol of the oppression of the people, and you have the chief Jewish religious leader who's supposed to be bearing the concerns of his people before God. And at best, you would think they might be able to be civil to one another. Instead, what you have is Caiaphas working hand in glove with the Roman governor to the point that he never does anything that the Roman governor finds irritating. Caiaphas had power and prestige, and he used it to preserve Caiaphas's power and prestige. Does some good come out of it? Oh, I'm sure. For a little while they avoid complete destruction, but that's more of a rationalization than anything. And, we're not all that different from other people. Sometimes we do things that are self-centered. Sometimes we don't care how our actions affect other people as long as we get what we want. And sometimes we're even able to convince ourselves that doing what we want is best because it has some trickle-down effect for other people. We're not all that different. So Caiaphas has power, and he uses his power for Caiaphas. And it's because of wanting to preserve his own power that they're plotting to kill Jesus. So now, back to Matthew. That's the backstory. So they begin to have all of these people come in. They're looking for false witnesses. Verse 60, they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. And I love the picture because in my mind it's almost cartoonish. You know, you have these 71 people plus Jesus, and there's just this long line of people who are trying to curry favor or get money, and they're coming in with these stories that are so outlandish and so untrue that nobody believes them. I just picture them all just sitting there shaking their heads because of the stories that they're hearing. Finally, it says, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is the testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He's spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He's worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" So they're looking for something, and finally 2 come forward, and they say, "We heard Jesus say, I'm able to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days." Now, Jesus may have said this any number of times, but it is a quote of what Jesus says when he cleanses the temple. The cleansing of the temple is when Jesus goes in and he chases out all of the people who are making a profit from religious worship. And he reminds the people that the temple of God was set up to be a house of prayer. It was set up to be a place where people connect with God. And instead, they've perverted the religion and made it all about business instead. And so it was then that he said that he was able to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But it also says he's not talking about the brick and mortar temple. What he's talking about is his body, because he in himself is the fulfillment of the temple, and he in himself is going to make the way for us to get to God. In other words, Jesus is saying there, you have made a mockery of God, you've made a mockery of religion, but I'm going to fix everything. And it's interesting then, Caiaphas asks Jesus and says, well, don't you have anything to say about this? And don't read too much into that, because silence is a big theme here. And Jesus finally says, you've said that, which is essentially a nice way to say yes. And what's funny is Jesus listens to this whole litany of false accusations. And finally he gets this one. I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And Jesus essentially says, yep, that one I'll fess up to. Because when it says, I am able, what that means is Jesus has the power. The only thing that they can get to stick on Jesus is the truth. And when they condemn Jesus, they're basically condemning him for being the Messiah, not for being a rabble-rouser. Jesus says, I'm able to do that, which means he's got the power too. So Caiaphas has this power, and Jesus says he's got this power too. Caiaphas uses his power to do what's best for Caiaphas. What is Jesus going to use his power to do? And Jesus goes on, it's like he says, Caiaphas says, are you the Messiah? Jesus says, yep, only it's worse than you think. Because, and then he quotes Daniel chapter 7, I am the Son of Man. And Son of Man language is Jesus' favorite name for himself. Throughout the New Testament, he calls himself the Son of Man more than any other thing. And it's technical language out of Daniel chapter 7. So what does Jesus mean by that, and what's happening in Daniel chapter 7 that he's picking up on? In Daniel chapter 7, you have this picture of the people of God. The people who love God, who are seeking to follow him and serve him, and they are being oppressed on every side. By nations, by people. I mean, they are beaten down, they are in exile, bad things are happening to God's people. And God sends the Son of Man, who breaks the power of the oppressors and sets God's people free. And Jesus says, I'm that one. And so he's making this enormous political statement that goes beyond just throwing off Roman rule. He's basically saying, wherever the people of God are oppressed, I'm the one who's present, breaking the power of sin and death and oppression and setting those people free. And the best part about that is it's not just for a few years in Judea, it's for all time. Because he says the Son of Man ultimately sits down next to God. And nowhere in Scripture does Jesus reveal himself more than he does here. Jesus says, I'm representing the God who loves you. I'm representing the God who cares about you. I'm representing the God who sees the oppression of your past. I'm representing the God who sees the bad things that have been done to you. I'm representing the God who sees the bad things that you have done. And I'm not here to condemn you. I'm here to rescue you, to remove from you the oppression in your life, to break the power of sin and death in your life. So you've got the high priest Caiaphas, who uses his power to do what's best for Caiaphas. And you have Jesus, who uses his power at great cost to himself to do what's best for you and for me and for all of the people. The high priest reacts to this blasphemy because Jesus compares himself to God. And when he reacts to the blasphemy and condemns Jesus to death, Caiaphas gets exactly what he wants. His power, his prestige are maintained. The status quo will go back to what it is. But at the same time, in irony of ironies, Caiaphas makes happen what he fears the most. Only it's not just an upheaval that happens with the Jewish people. It's a change in the entire world that echoes all the way back to us. Two people, both using power. One to his own advantage, one to help other people and redeem the world. So a couple of points to make at the end. How would you use your power? Who do you lean more towards? Do you lean more towards the Caiaphas, I'm going to take care of me? Or do you lean more towards the Jesus thing? I'm going to take care of other people. I'm going to participate in what God is doing in the world. And I look about, at my life and the things that I have done to impact people. And one of the greatest fears that I have is that I would be confronted with something, and you could argue this happens all day long, just sometimes you pay more attention, that I would be confronted with something really big that I would have the power to do something about. And later on, when I went to bed that night, or being confronted by a friend, somebody would say to me, you could have done something, and you didn't. I fear that. Because I want to be over here with the Jesus-y stuff. I want to be a part of what God is doing in the world. I don't want all of the power and whatever prestige I have to be used just to make sure that I keep my power and prestige. And I think about what would have happened standing there in the warehouse in IKEA if the dude had hauled off and hit that kid. Because I think it would have had to done something. And it would have gotten crazy really quickly. But sometimes, when you use the power for the good, it costs you something. Jesus would be the prime example of that. How are you using the power you have? Whether it's the power over family members, the power over employees, the power over friends. How are you using the power that you have? This whole series of looking at the cast of characters leading up to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection is really not as much as about the people that we see as it is about who Jesus is and how those people help us see a different side to Jesus that we might not normally see. And so in this interaction with Caiaphas, it really gives us this moment to look at what God chooses to do for us. And how God, of his own free will, gives and gives and gives and sacrifices himself. Philippians 2 talks about this, where it says that Jesus lays aside all of his prerogatives, all of his powers, and comes to set us free. What do you do with your power? So there's three questions I want you to think about for a second. The first is, how are you using your power, whatever it is, for the good of God and others. Secondly, particularly in light of Jesus fessing up to be the Messiah, the one who saves us from our sins, who do you really believe that Jesus is? And the third, what steps do you need to take to more accurately reflect what you believe about how you use power, about who Jesus is in your actions? Let's pray, and let's take 30 seconds to wrestle with those things. Loving God, we start from a place of being grateful. Grateful for what you have done for us in Jesus. Because Jesus shows us that you love us even when we're not lovely. That you find worth and value in us even when we don't feel like there is worth or value there. That Jesus reminds us that anything that we've said, anything that we've done, it all can be forgiven. And we can be renewed and restored into relationship with you. And so we're grateful for that. And God, we want to respond not just in gratitude, but in a gratitude that changes how we react to other people. Because we want other people that we love and know, and people that we don't, to see the grace of God in our lives. We want to be people that have been transformed, that then use that power to bring hope and healing and reconciliation through Jesus to others. So God, we are really grateful for the opportunity to stop and think about who we are and how we reflect you to other people. God, would you continue to change us so that we will be more like Jesus and less like Caiaphas. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.